A subscriber asked that I compare the Monolith M1060C to the AUDEZE LCD-X. I know what some of you are thinking. That's not even a fair comparison. And I tend to agree with that sentiment. But I had some time on my hands and this comparison was simple enough to do. So, how does the M1060C, a headphone which costs about $300, compare to the LCD-X, one of AUDEZE'S professional class headphones that retails for $1,700? Both headphones are pretty large. They are similar in size and weight, though clearly there is a huge difference in construction and materials. The M1060C has ear cups that swivel all over the place. It is incredibly annoying since there is barely any tension holding them in the proper way. Every time I take these headphones off their block, I have to fuss with the ear cups to get everything aligned correctly, every single time. The LCD-X, on the other hand, is the total opposite. Its ear cup movement is restricted by stoppers. You can turn the ear cups slightly left and right and up and down. But you can rest assured you won't have the same frustration as with the M1060C. The yoke and headbands are also starkly different. AUDEZE uses a slider mechanism for adjusting size and has a metal headband with a thin sliver of leather hanging below. Think what you will of the AUDEZE headphones, but their headband design simply sucks. The lack of padding and overall weight means you will develop hot spots on your head. The M1060C has super cheap and ugly yoke and headband. It looks and feels like sheet metal that was quickly bent and sent out the door. The M1060C also has a piece of leather hanging below the headband, but it has some padding. I think most people will be okay with it, but some might need additional padding. You can buy a cheap headband pad from Amazon and twist tie it to the M1060C if you want. We do not need to belabor the point. The LCD-X has much better build and materials, but with nearly 6 times the differential in price, it better have better leather and build. Comfort is subjective, but I think it's safe to say that neither headphone is the most comfortable or least comfortable. They're somewhere in the tolerance of most people, I think. AUDEZE claims that the LCD-X has, quote, astonishingly accurate sound reproduction. It says its headphone is for professionals. AUDEZE says that the headphone reveals, quote, even minute details with crystal clear transparency, and the sound signature is supposed to be neutral. Monolith says that the M1060C has a balanced sound signature, spectacular imaging, and low distortion. They unambiguously are aiming at the audiophile community, not professionals. If you recall, the original 1060 drivers had distortion and weird resonances that a lot of people experienced. Owners of the 1060 modified their headphones to mitigate some of the faults. Monolith re-engineered their 1060 drivers and put those in the 1060C. AUDEZE has been using their particular phasor implemented driver since around 2015, I think. For this test, I decided to use a neutral amp DAC that has plenty of power to drive these headphones. I resorted to the RME 80i2 DAC. I used an AB switch with the headphones. I played music over Amazon Music HD, and of course I tried to volume match. Considering the vastly different target audiences for each of these products, we need to figure out what we are actually testing for. The typical analysis of the frequency range will of course occur, but I think it is important that we put claims to the test as well. Moreover, I am hypercritical of companies who boast specific performance from their products. If they make a specific promise, then we should hold them accountable. Consequently, because AUDEZE revels in hyping everything, we will hold their hype to appropriate scrutiny. As for the 1060C, the only claims we have are that the headphones have low distortion, a claim that can be easily tested, and a balanced sound. Balanced signature is a vague term that does not have much useful information. Therefore, I will assume, for purposes of this comparison, that the 1060C has full elevated bass, crystal clear mids, and good treble extension without harshness. There are notable differences in bass response between these headphones, somewhat in quantity and mostly in the transients. On Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the LCD-X somewhat recreated the sub-bass rumble at the beginning of the song. It has very fast decay. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the song, the organ cut through the mix and melded heavily with the other instruments. The mid-bass rumble came through and seemed about accurate in timbre. Although I could perceive sounds other than the organ and the rumble, it was not consistent. Indeed, the organ easily overpowered or melded with the other tones. The M1060C had a very similar sub-bass response as with the LCD-X. The sub-bass was audible, but just barely. It should have been more elevated in both headphones. Transience was almost identical to the LCD-X, but I would say that the 1060C was just a little bit slower with just slightly longer decay. When the crescendo hit, the organ cut through the mix and melded with the other instruments. The mid-bass rumble was less emphasized than on the LCD-X. It was just a little easier to hear the other instruments on the 1060C than on the LCD-X. The vocals that chime in near the end of the song were clearer on the 1060C and were more easily audible sooner on the 1060C than on the LCD-X. But this was a change by minor degrees. On Conquer by Overwork, the 1060C recreated the rolling marble effect at the beginning of the song. The mid-bass impact was hard and fast and the timbre accurate. I could hear the various drums in either the right or left ear cups. Although there was some melding among instruments, each instrument had its own tonality. The synth was clear and not harsh. Indeed, the synth sounded about one step ahead of the drums throughout the song. On the LCD-X, the rolling marble effect sounded more accurate than it did on the 1060C, though it was a little bit more recessed. Mid-bass impact was as hard on the 1060C as on the LCD-X, but the transience on the LCD-X was faster. The multiple drum tonalities were a little harder to hear on the LCD-X than on the 1060C. In other words, the LCD-X tended to meld the drums, whereas they remained clearer on the 1060C. The synth appeared nearly the same between the two headphones, but had a bit more harshness on the LCD-X than what I heard on the 1060C. The synth sounded just a bit sharper on the LCD-X, in other words. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Uproar, New Patek, and Reel It In. The LCD-X was consistent on every song. The sub-bass was rolled off and barely present. The mid-bass lacked proper emphasis and sounded quite blunted. In other words, the bass instruments were either hard to hear or simply sounded like someone had draped a bedsheet over the speaker. Vocals were easily 2 steps ahead of the mix and had sparkle. I could not say that the vocals were shouty, but they were definitely not neutral. They sounded too forward of every single mix. On the 1060C, the bass had slightly greater emphasis, particularly in the mid-bass. Sub-bass was similar to what I heard on the LCD-X. Transience was a little slower on the 1060C. Vocals appeared about 1 to 2 steps ahead of the mix. They did not quite have the sparkle they should in hip-hop songs, however. Nevertheless, the vocals never sounded shouty and never seemed too far ahead of the other instruments. Mid-bass, though louder on the 1060C, still had a slight veiled nature to it. For bass response, I would say that neither headphone is actually neutral. That is not surprising for the 1060C, but should be for the LCD-X. Both headphones roll off sub-bass. The 1060C has a slight emphasis on mid-bass compared to the LCD-X. The LCD-X has slightly faster transients, but not by a significant amount, I think. What is noteworthy is that the LCD-X consistently melded bass instruments. The 1060C melded as well, but managed to keep those same instruments clearer than the LCD-X. The mids are quite different between these headphones. Presentation is once again the word of the day. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, the song has natural grain and sibilance in the recording. Some headphones roll off the sibilance, others stamp out the grain, and some elevated one or the other. The LCD-X elevated the sibilance several decibels. It hit my personal sibilance threshold. S sounds were easily peaky. The grain was about accurate, however. The drums and guitar tended to meld heavily, and it was nearly impossible to pick out the tonalities, to say nothing of the nuanced differences. On the 1060C, Orla's voice was dead accurate. Her sibilance was also not accentuated. It was not elevated as it had been on the LCD-X. The energy was still present, but it did not get harsh or peaky. On the other hand, the 1060C did slightly emphasize the grain in her voice, where the LCD-X kept it fairly accurate. The drum and guitar were just a little bit clearer on the 1060C than on the LCDX. Instruments tended to meld on the 1060C as well, but the individual tonalities were a little bit easier to perceive than they were on the LCDX. In Want You Back by Haim, the 1060C did not accentuate the primary vocalist's sibilance. It was accurate. There was no grain in the track as with the previous song, so there was no issue about that. The two backup vocalists were clear, though their tonalities tended to meld. When the entire mix played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one, and it was difficult to hear their individual tonalities. Some other headphones are able to show the nuanced differences in the three voices throughout the song, but not the 1060C. When all instruments play, vocals meld. The drums, piano, and guitar sounded natural and accurate, though also tended to meld. On the LCDX, the primary vocalist's sibilance was accentuated and her voice sounded just slightly harsher than on the 1060C. The two backup vocalists sounded clear and distinct, one in each ear cup. When the entire mix played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded to the same degree as on the 1060C. Once again, their individual tonalities were missing, just as on the 1060C. When the other instruments played lightly, then the backup vocalists sounded a little clearer on the LCDX than they had on the 1060C. The drums, piano, and guitar all melded, and just a little bit more so than they did on the 1060C. In superposition by Young the Giant, the drums sounded muffled on the LCDX. The bass guitar was audible, but definitely recessed. The ukulele and guitar had fast transients and about correct timbre. The LCDX elevated the primary vocalist's sibilance by a few decibels. It was nowhere near as aggressive as it had been with female vocalists, however. There is one backup vocalist who should pop through the mix. The LCDX does not allow that to happen. Indeed, even during portions of the song where I know I should hear the backup singer, I simply could not hear him. The vocals melded significantly. Indeed, all instruments melded, and nuanced details of the way a string is plucked also gets shrouded. On the 1060C, the mid-bass was slightly elevated and had slightly longer transients. The primary vocalist sibilance was not accentuated and appeared perfectly accurate. The ukulele and guitar sounded natural. The backup vocalist was not audible, just as in the LCDX. I kept listening for that voice, and it was always melded with the primary vocalist. The bass guitar was more audible on the 1060C and added emphasis throughout the song, whereas on the LCDX, the bass guitar was veiled. Overall, the LCDX does not present more mids detailed than the 1060C. What is actually different is the way each headphone presents the vocals. The LCDX has this tinny effect, bolstered by the emphasized sibilance in female and male vocalists. The rolled-off bass and forward mids results in a vocal presentation that seems just a bit unnatural. The 1060C's presentation of vocals is more neutral and accurate. It does not seem to roll off sibilance, but it also does not push it forward. Vocals tended to sound more full, possibly because the bass instruments were present to add a bit more emphasis. Surprisingly, the treble response is fairly similar between these headphones. On Scherzo for X-Wings, the 1060C reproduced the brass and horns with just about neutral sound. I believe those instruments needed just a tiny bit more emphasis, and some of their energy was missing. However, nothing sounded muffled or shrouded. I could hear group sets, but not individual instruments. The headphones gave a stereo effect and lacked depth and verticality. The LCDX had more neutral and accurate treble than the 1060C. The brass and horns had the correct amount of energy and timbre. In comparison, the 1060C sounded just a tiny bit rolled off in that area. I could not hear individual instruments and only heard group sets. There was just a bit more clarity among group sets on the LCDX than on the 1060C. Transients was a little faster on the LCDX. As with the 1060C, the LCDX lacked depth and verticality and presented the mix in stereo, left and right only. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the LCDX presented the piano as if it was about 5 feet from me. It did not emphasize the bassier notes and in fact rolled them off. Yet, the mid-frequency notes were pushed forward and sounded off timbre, a bit too in your face if you ask me. The cello melded with the piano notes, but tended to have accurate tonality. The creaking of the pianist's bench was audible, but not particularly clear. The shifting of the cello's weight was rendered similarly. On the 1060C, the piano appeared about 8 feet from me. The bassier notes were slightly more emphasized. The mid-frequency notes were not nearly as forward as they had been on the LCD-X. Transients was just a tiny bit slower on the 1060C, but the overall impression was that the piano was easier to listen to. The cello sounded smoother on the 1060C than on the LCD-X, but melded with the other piano notes. Whereas on the LCD-X, the cello sounded more lean, on the 1060C the cello had a fuller sound. The amount of detail I could hear was no different from the LCD-X. The creaking of the pianist's bench was ever so slightly easier to perceive on the LCD-X, but the shifting of the cello was easier to hear on the 1060C. On Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 1060C recreated the drum kit in the left ear cup, the piano in the right, the bass in the background, and the saxophone dead center. The saxophone sounded accurate with correct timbre. It did not get harsh or peaky. There was good separation among all instruments, though their tones did meld. I could not hear the different tonalities between the cymbal and hi-hat on the drum kit, and they sounded fairly alike. On the LCD-X, the placement of the instruments was the same as on the 1060C. The piano sounded louder in the right ear cup than the drums in the left. The saxophone was more forward than it had been on the 1060C. The bass was hard to hear and was generally recessed. The saxophone did not get harsh, but did have just a tiny bit more energy than it did on the 1060C. As with the 1060C, I could not easily hear the differences between the cymbal and hi-hat on the drum kit. However, the LCD-X was clearer overall. The treble response is very similar between these headphones. The only meaningful difference is that the LCD-X adds just a tiny bit more energy in some instruments than the 1060C. I believe in this regard, the LCD-X is probably more accurate. The LCD-X also tends to have just a bit more treble extension and clarity than the 1060C does. On some occasions it is obvious, and on some it is by small margins. I have tried to explain the details I hear throughout this test. I will not repeat what I said before. My overall findings are that the two headphones render the same amount, or very nearly the same amount, of detail. In other words, the LCD-X does not reproduce details that the 1060C steamrolled over. Indeed, this was blatantly obvious and needs no embellishment. The way some of the details were presented is different from one headphone to another. Creaking of wood is more easily heard on one headphone than the other, and the breaths of vocalists is slightly easier to hear on the other. Separation of instruments is hit and miss. Sometimes both headphones perform nearly identical, and other times the LCD-X is slightly clearer. When bass instruments are prevalent, both headphones meld them together. Vocalists also tend to meld about the same on these headphones. The only notable difference was in treble, where the LCD-X usually had more clarity and better extension. I must emphasize this. At no point during this test, and certainly not once in the 12+ months I have used the LCD-X, did the LCD-X provide details that other headphones entirely missed. Nuance is not the LCD-X's forte. In this regard, it is exactly the same as the 1060C. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This song has layers of details, including wind, rustling of tall grass, synth, piano, children playing in the background, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The king of this test is the Focal Clear, which presents 16 footsteps in the first 45 seconds. I decided to reconfirm this months-old result and update the number of footsteps I hear. Whereas the original Clear test was for 45 seconds, the new test is for the full 60 seconds that all other headphones get. So, the updated Clear test for 60 seconds reveals 18 footsteps. The second best headphone on this test is the Austrian Audio Hi-X55, which rendered 14 to 15 footsteps in the first 60 seconds. The LCD-X presented 9 to 10 footsteps in the first 60 seconds. The M1060C presented 7 to 8 footsteps in the first 60 seconds. Clearly, not a significant difference between the LCD-X and the 1060C, but a giant chasm between them and the Clear and the X55. It should be no surprise that the LCD-X has larger soundstage than the 1060C. The LCD-X's open back design provides a noticeable improvement in soundstage. This, when combined with its leaner base, sometimes results in cleaner presentation overall. The 1060C has soundstage comparable to most close-back headphones. Its slight bass emphasis contributes to the more intimate experience. The LCD-X has about above-average soundstage, probably about the same as the hifi Sundara. The M1060C has soundstage equal to that of the LCD-1 and the HD6XX and 660S. There is a clear difference overall in sound presentation. When you look at the nitty-gritty, you may say that these headphones appear to perform the same. In detail retrieval, bass response, and treble, yes, I think you could argue that the 1060C and LCD-X are not far apart at all. But the presentation of the entire sound is not the same. There is a noticeable difference. The 1060C is a warmer sounding headphone, more soothing, more relaxing than the LCD-X. Its bass is a bit more elevated than on the LCD-X, and its transients is a little bit slower. This results in a more accurate and pleasing bass response, one that appears to suit many music genres. The 1060C needs a slightly more treble extension and energy to be accurate in that regard, but it is not muffled or veiled. Treble instruments stand out but are on the gentler side, more polite, easier to listen to. The LCD-X has bass that is very similar to that of the 1060C, except that the mid-bass is just a bit less emphasized and transients is faster. I do not think that the bass response is neutral on the LCD-X and would describe it as rolled off, creating a false sense of insufficient bass in songs. This was readily apparent in hip-hop songs. The treble response was clearer on the LCD-X. It was close to neutral here. The energy of instruments was accurate, as was their timbre. Compared to the 1060C, the LCD-X was not polite, but neither was it harsh. Orchestral pieces sounded more true to the original recording on the LCD-X than on the 1060C. But the mids is where things are simply not satisfactory. The LCD-X pushes mids forward, especially vocals. Female vocals sound harsh because of the sibilance spike. Male vocals are not nearly as bad, but the sibilance push is still there. I would not say that the vocals are necessarily shouty on the LCD-X, but neither are they accurate. Vocals overall sound lean and not full. I attribute this, at least partially, to the insufficient bass response. You can correctly assume that different tracks, different artists, may likely not suffer from the same issues I heard on my test tracks. To be honest, some songs sound slightly warm and natural, while others have the inconsistency I just spoke of regarding the LCD-X. Moreover, each person's sonic preference is going to be different. One person's shouty vocals is another person's definition of pleasant vocal-forward headphone. The point is that we do not get mired in personal preferences. That simply does not matter. What does matter is that the LCD-X's rendition of vocals and mids is not really accurate. It is not true to the original recording. It is not neutral. There is a reason why Monolith headphones continue to do so well among audiophiles. The affordable price and non-hype advertisement is a refreshing change. But Monolith headphones are not perfect, especially the 1060 series. The 1060C has laughable design. I simply hate the ear cup movement, the headband, and overall construction. It does the job and is sturdy, but there are some frustrating issues, particularly with the swiveling ear cups. Monolith claims that the 1060C has no distortion and has a balanced sound. Well, neither it nor the LCD-X have distortion. That's quite a low bar anyway. As for balanced sound, yes, I think that is probably correct. There is no set rule what a balanced sound actually is. It is an amorphous concept left to the imagination of each individual listener. My original definition is probably close to what most people will agree is balanced sound. Are there more balanced headphones? Yes, there are other headphones that seem more balanced to me personally. For example, I think that the Sivka Phoenix probably outdoes the M1060C in many ways, including cleaner, more powerful bass response, more overall clarity, and better treble extension. But just because I think that the Phoenix has a different balanced sound does not mean it has a better sound than the 1060C. I think there are technically better headphones than the 1060C for either the same or cheaper price, but if you are adamant about buying a planar magnetic headphone, you could do a lot worse. Turning to the LCD-X, Ay. What can I say that won't upset Audeze fanboys? Well, probably this. Audeze is the best company ever, and all its products are near perfect. There is nothing wrong with them, and you should be lucky to buy one. Do yourselves a favor and buy an Audeze headphone immediately, and pay full price because you need to thank Audeze for all its hard work and ethical behavior. Or I could just tell you the truth. Well, I made it this far, so I might as well chug along. The LCD-X doesn't do half the things Audeze promises. Surprise, surprise! Audeze lied again. You know, instead of saying that Audeze lied, I should just say that Audeze spoke. There's no difference. When can you tell a teenager is lying? When their lips are moving. When can you tell Audeze is lying? When they claim anything. It is hard to find another company that so blatantly misrepresents its products. I used to get upset about this, but now it's just laughable. Look, the LCD does not have the ability to render minute details. Audeze is jerking itself off about that. Sure, the LCD-X reproduces details, but so do Beats headphones. Big deal. Had Audeze simply said that you can hear natural details, then maybe we would be fine. But no, Audeze had to double and triple down and emphasize that this headphone recreates minute details. That is not true. The LCD-X does not recreate clear details, and often misses details that are recorded into a track. Multiple vocalists are generally lost. Creaking of wood, plucking of strings, drums, guitar, everything tends to meld. Indeed, if you buy the cheaper Focal Clear, you will hear a tremendous difference in detail retrieval and clarity. In fact, you do not need to buy a $1,000 plus headphone. Buy the X55 instead at $300 if details is what matters to you. Then there is the claim that the LCD-X is neutral. I roll my eyes every time I see Audeze repeat this statement. It has never been true and never will be true. The LCD-X is simply not neutral. The LCD-X rolls off bass, and it has an unnatural vocal push with a sibilance emphasis that is borderline uncomfortable. Hip-hop songs do not have the correct reproduction of bass. Pop songs sound harsher than they should. Bass response, though fast, is underwhelming and not true to the original recording. The saving grace is that the LCD-X has accurate, close to neutral treble. The treble response is actually quite good. But to say that the LCD-X is neutral is a false statement. If you want neutral, you should look to the Allo audio headphones or to the Aventone Planar. There is absolutely nothing remarkable about either the M1060C or the LCD-X. I think the 1060C is overpriced, particularly in light of its build and competition. $200 is where I think I would price it. Any more and you're getting ripped off. Sorry, Monolith, but times have changed and your prices have not. I cannot cut you any slack. But if I think that the 1060C is overpriced, then the LCD-X is laughably overpriced. The LCD-X does nothing better than cheaper competition. In fact, you can find true neutral headphones for 1/5 the price. You can find fast bass transients, more natural and accurate mids, and equally good treble extension and clarity, not to mention equal detail retrieval and soundstage in cheaper headphones. What strikes me as unfair is how Audeze places its headphones. They charge an insulting price for something that doesn't match the description, then hypes it to no end. Well, let me put it this way. The Aventone Planar is about $400 and has technical performance no worse than the LCD-X, except that the Planar is actually neutral, not pretend neutral like the LCD-X. I would also like to know how many professionals are spending $1,700 for one pair of studio headphones. I suspect that list is very small. And those who are spending their cash on Audeze marketing, I would also like to know how often they use the LCD-X. I think an answer to both questions would be quite enlightening. Regardless, the LCD-X's price is bogus, and I simply cannot figure out what is an appropriate price because the price differential between it and equally performing headphones is so vastly different. Neither headphone is value priced, but the LCD-X is not just an insulting proposition, but a dishonest one to boot. This leads me to the conclusion. you can do better than either headphone. The 1060C is not a replacement for the LCDX. It's a totally different sound. But while we are at this game, I might as well emphasize that the LCDX is also not a worthwhile investment. Put the stupid hype aside and really think about this headphone. Of all the reviews you can read online, how many actually do A/B comparisons? How many read like advertisements? How many are personal opinions about how the person liked the sound signature? You are entitled to love whatever you buy, and you should feel free to tell others that you like a product. There's nothing wrong with that. But let us not pretend that such discourse is a substitute for actual testing and comparisons. So, while the 1060C is not an LCDX, the LCDX is also not an LCDX marketed on the AUDEZE website. I think, honestly, that the LCDX is a fine headphone, and you may very much enjoy its sound. But there are cheaper alternatives that do as good, if not better.